Bastion is an isometric action-adventure game from Supergiant Games, and it will now get reviewed. It's a bit difficult to say what's the most important thing in a game like Bastion. The emphasis is almost evenly split between what the player does and what the player simply listens to. In a way, the storytelling methods aren't any different from a game like Portal or Half-Life, where their player gets a bit of story and flavor shared with them as they play the game. But the emphasis on the narration is so strong in Bastion that it may in fact be more important than anything the player actually does. So I'm going to start by focusing on gameplay elements, and then we're going to come back to this stuff later. So the player controls a character known as the Kid. The camera is locked in an isometric 3/4 perspective as the Kid smashes through stages that assemble themselves around him in a predetermined way. There's a variety of weapons and other trinkets to pick up, and the player can use 2 different weapons at a time, along with a customizable special move that is usually some sort of other attack, so maybe 3 weapons. Controls are not exactly tight, but the game is built around them the way they are, so lack of mobility due to attacking is a thing, but not exactly in a bad way. The game's more about picking the moment to commit to an attack, rather than being able to fluidly string all of your movement together. Combat actually is almost turn-based in a way, where you run and dodge like crazy until you're ready to plant your feet and take your shot. And in this regard, it doesn't really feel like any other game I've played. The Kid can jump in a few specific sections, but platforming only exists in a few edge cases, and it isn't part of the game the vast majority of the time. This is really a game about moving around a known space that builds itself around you, and you're usually relying on your roll ability and picking the right moment to attack. It's more akin to a bullet hell game than anything else, and in many cases the level of focus required almost produces a meditative state, similar to what you'd find in a bullet hell game. Each weapon the Kid gets has its own quirks to learn and master. For example, some melee weapons can be thrown, and specific timing on a throw will result in more damage. The hammer does more damage if you stop and plant your feet really formally rather than using it in stride. And these weapons can all be paired up with different upgrade options for each weapon, different combinations of weapons, and different stat boosting spirits, and different bonus weapons, and it all really lets you customize the gameplay around the playstyle you start to feel the best at. It all gets disregarded when you get handed a battering ram on the last stage, but it's just the last stage. It's like 3 minutes. The game has some short challenge mode stages to let you explore each of those weapons a little bit, so you can get more opportunities to examine a weapon. The thing is, just picking one up during a stage doesn't always give a new weapon a fair shake. In some cases, the stage is built around the new weapon, but in others I found myself just sticking with what I knew because it wasn't worth getting acquainted with a new weapon when I'd already become good with the old one and upgraded it 2 or 3 times. This becomes even more pronounced when you consider some of the stages are built around a specific weapon, which means why learn the one for this stage when it's just going to get thrown out in the next stage for a new weapon? At a certain point, you might as well just get really good with one that's going to be your bread and butter. So in between stages, you go to the Bastion, which is your home base where you can, spend your money and get upgrades and so on. And then you go to a map where you can ostensibly select the stage you want to go to next. This is a bit of a complaint because the stages can't be revisited, so the map only really serves to allow you to select between some of those challenge stages I mentioned. Or maybe you have 2 options for the stage you can pick next, and after you pick one, you have to pick the other. So it gives this illusion of flexibility and maybe a bit of insight into world geography, but in the end it's mostly smoke and mirrors. Likewise, the stages building themselves out of tiles looks cool, but I never encountered really a puzzle or gameplay situation where I noticed them using it for anything but an aesthetic purpose. In some situations, the self-assembling levels almost backfired, as the pieces only float up when you're near them, and in many cases this can replace actual exploration based on visuals where you see perhaps a path, and instead you mindlessly edge hug to see if a new path will form itself, because you gotta get close. Given that the player is essentially doing this exploration without any real way of determining where a path will form, I wasn't a fan. It might as well have been a coin flip. Exploration in stages in general actually felt a little unsatisfying to me. There are often multiple ways to proceed, but there is no way to know which way is the side path and which one is advancing the story. There's narration on both. That in and of itself isn't a problem, But the tendency for the player to get locked off arbitrarily when on the main path can become a bit frustrating when you later find out you missed something, and good level design would dictate that there should be some sort of cue guiding the player's decision making on some level, even if it's subtle, such as following a noise that gets louder, or going from one landmark to another, or following a trail of blood, or something. It doesn't matter whether these things lead along the side path or the main path, but from a level design point of view and from a psychology point of view, the player needs some information to base a decision on. They need to think, I'm following the trail of blood or I'm not following the trail of blood. In Bastion, there are just paths, and the player kind of wonders if they're approaching the end of the stage or not as they walk on them slightly aimlessly. Combined with there being no way to revisit a stage after it's been completed, exploration is a bit of a dud, in my opinion, which is a shame because the stages form themselves and that would be a great visual indicator of whether or not you're revisiting somewhere you've been before. The game has a New Game Plus, which technically lets you revisit things, but everything's put back into a pristine state, so it's as if you never played it before, and it's not quite scratching the itch I'm talking about. The short version of the story is that an event called the Calamity happened, and it was quite calamitous in general. It broke apart most of the world and killed almost everyone. This isn't really a spoiler, you find out in the first 9 seconds, give or take. There's an old man named Rux who narrates the game at a sort of flying fortress called the Bastion, and powering up the Bastion can probably help people, maybe? So you go get cores and shards, which are rocks. As the story goes on, there are some things I would consider to be problems, but none of them really do too much to diminish the overall experience that much. For example, in movies, there's this rule called show, don't tell, where you could have maybe someone say, James is very heroic, but if it's really important, you could just have him act heroic in a scene. And now we're going to go back and talk about Bastion again, because the game has that narrator, and it basically only tells. There's just continuous exposition, and you're mostly a passenger who feels more like a vehicle for moving the playhead of the narration forward rather than having a really important impact on the story. What you do is smash things, and then a richer story is told around you. There's also some very heavy-handed MacGuffining in the story. Getting thing A will solve problem B because the story said so. And in Bastion, there isn't really much more to it than that. Lots of stories have a structure like this, but usually there's at least an implicit understanding for how the cause and effect are going to work. If Rocky wants to win a boxing fight, then he needs to find a person to train him. Leonardo DiCaprio wants to see his kids again, he needs to trade favors with a guy who can clear his name. In the case of Bastion, if you get a core, or maybe a shard, they're pretty much the same. Even in the game's programming, they're the same. The Bastion can maybe time travel or go to space? Or fix things somehow. We mostly just see these shards sticking in the ground. I read some articles suggesting that they kept some places somewhat intact because they offered protection from the Calamity, but I don't know. They mostly just sit on the ground and I get caught up on these things and it's not really clear how they'll help. I get a little upset when the game talks about how important and necessary shards and cores are when they pretty clearly just sit on the ground. One place kind of falls apart when we take the core away, but they mostly do nothing. We plug them into the Bastion to power up some buildings, but up until then, they don't do anything. It's all a bit too transparent for me. I get that they need us to play the stages, but those could have been people we were rescuing rather than plugging a rock into an unmanned distillery. In the end, though, this sort of analysis isn't too important to a game like Bastion anyway. The game feels more like listening to an old man tell a story, and the enjoyment is in listening to the telling itself rather than the specifics of what actually happens. In a perfect world, you would have both, like the Shawshank Redemption, but in the end, the game does such a good job that it would be interesting hearing Rux describe the kid going to get some milk from the grocery store. I'm not even using hyperbole when I say that. Even listen to how the soundtrack starts. It's not with music, it's with Rux talking about how they used to listen to music. You're being invited into something, and being around and being part of that is what makes it all work.
Listen. All this takes a lot of getting used to. And you do get used to it. After a while. There's 3 things I'll always miss, though. 1, not having to watch my step all the time. 2, forget about 2. And 3, I miss the songs.
Speaking of the music, in this game, it's definitely a major strength. It establishes the mood very well, it's great to listen to on its own or in the game, and it offers a more unique sound than most games usually have. It treads outside the usual genres. My only knock on the soundtrack would be that a few themes seem to be a bit overrepresented in the game, so by the end you might feel that the game has less music than it actually does, just because the distribution is a little lopsided. This is a pretty minor knock though, as the game is short enough that none of the music ever really becomes annoying. The voice acting is top notch, and when I say that, I mean it might be the best performance in a video game ever. For a long time, people would have 2 sets of standards for voice acting in video games. I remember getting into arguments on some forums of people saying like, Final Fantasy X had good voice acting. And I would say, it doesn't sound like an Aaron Sorkin movie. It doesn't sound like A Few Good Men.
Did you order the code red? You're goddamn right I did!
Why the awkward, bad acted laugh? Here it is, for once and for all, James Arnold Taylor telling you about the Titus laugh. It was supposed to be an awkward, goofy, dumb laugh.
Objection, do you think they deserve to die, Mr. Haley? Answer the question.
Carly, don't answer that question.
Yes, they deserve to die, and I hope they burn in hell.
Acknowledge that something good happened that you weren't in the room for.
No.
Listen to my story. This may be our last chance.
And they'd be like, oh, well, those are movies, these are video games. And it's like, I never bought that. Voice acting should just be good. And for a long time it wasn't. And if you want to point to a game that threw down a gauntlet and established a new standard, this could be it. Yeah, the gameplay and music are fine, but what makes Bastion special is the narrator. And listening to Logan Cunningham talk and tell you the story is the reason you should play this game. In terms of graphic design, Gen Z has established herself as one of the best artists in video games, and Bastion was pretty much the start of that. The game has lots of 2D art and a strong aesthetic. The color palette is varied and strong, it has a bold statement, and it's even more profound when you consider it was released in the era of the brown and gray gritty realism, where every game looked like a bowl of old cereal. So kudos to them for bucking the trend. In some of the levels, it's a bit difficult to read where you are and what's going on, but I think this is more of a level design issue rather than art, and I've already talked a little bit about the level design. The game is a joy to look at, is the big takeaway, and the aesthetic, sound, and story all mesh very well. Welcome to everyone's favorite section, Miscellany. The game is short. I don't mean that as a negative. I'd much rather play a game that doesn't overstay its welcome and leaves me wishing it could go on longer. Not having a billion quests to do collecting random items for random NPCs is fine with me. This is a game without filler. It was written, designed, and built to be short, sweet, and satisfying, and that's exactly what it is. There's some variability in length based on the challenges that you can undertake, but even those are pretty bite-sized, and I mean that in the best possible way. So, game difficulty is a challenging subject. Generally, games are supposed to get more challenging as they go on to scale with the increasing skill of the player, and lots of games also feature power-ups that, when you collect them, they make the player's character stronger. So, these two ideas often have dissonance. The player's getting better and the character's getting stronger, and those are building on each other exponentially. But the game needs to get harder, so the enemies get stronger in a way to negate your increase in skill and negate the building of the character that you've done. And that's lame. That's problem one. Problem two is some players are very skilled and experienced, and other players are new or not. And both types of players should be accommodated, and this is all a big problem. So Supergiant gets around this problem by introducing idols, which are basically themed checkboxes you can check to make the game harder and offer an increase in reward to you for doing so. Mo idols, mo money. I'm torn by this, because on the one hand it's a clever solution, and on the other hand I find it difficult to justify making the game harder for me on purpose. The logical part of my brain gets stuck in a loop where it argues, and it's like, you could get more treats if you just turn these things on, and then a different part argues back, but I won't need them if I keep them turned off. And I just end up pretending the feature doesn't exist. This isn't really a positive or negative criticism, I just think this is one of those philosophical challenges in gaming that doesn't really have an explicitly right answer. They came up with an interesting solution, and I'm glad they did, and I usually ignore it, and that's fine. They made it so I could. There's this idea in many fields like design and psychology called Gestalt. When people say the whole is more than the sum of its parts, this is what they're talking about. While Bastion holds up unusually well when examined on a piece-by-piece basis, the way it all fits together and weights emphasis in all the right ways is really what makes the game so enjoyable. It has a unique style and a specific artistic goal for the sort of game it wants to be, and it attains this without any ambition to reach further than that. If they made it twice as long, it would be half as good. But they paced it perfectly for what they had in mind, and playing it again after a few years away gave me the chance to enjoy it all over again, which I do not say with every game I replay. It isn't perfect, but I would still say it's a game everyone should play or experience, one way or the other.